Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is United Nations funds and programs. Dear learners, in this lecture, we shall try to explain how United Nations is the world's main organization for deliberating matters of peace and security. We shall analyze how its work, primarily with the focus on United Nations funds and programs, how this work encompasses far more than peacekeeping and conflict prevention, the traditional functions of United Nations. We shall elaborate on aims and objectives of United Nations funds and program to explain how the United Nations system includes a lot of entities dedicated to a wide range of areas including health, humanitarian needs, economic and cultural development. In this lecture, we shall also try to analyze role of United Nations as an important international organization with respect to international relations, and above all, how through United Nations funds and programs, the mandate of peace and security is secured by the working of United Nations. In this lecture, we shall analyze the working of United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environment Program, United Nations Population Fund, United Nations Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, United Nations Children Funds, UNICEF, and World Food Program. As we take the learning forward, let us first begin with by understanding working of United Nations. Dear learners, United Nations is post-Second World War international organization. It was founded in 1945, and this is very important to understand the context, namely that how after the post-Second World War, the focus of the world community was on maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations amongst nations, and promoting social progress, better living standards, human rights. Now, when we look at the context of post-Second World War and try to factor in role of international organizations, namely United Nations, it tells us that how when we try to situate the working of United Nations, translating it from 1945 era till the present times, United Nations indeed has come a long way. When we try to deliberate on United Nations, it's very important to have a look at the structure of United Nations. The main organs of the United Nations are the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, International Court of Justice, and United Nations Secretariat. There was also a Trusteeship Council which ceases to exist now after it's done with its function. With this, we now come to the another important aspect, namely looking at the main purposes of United Nations. It is to keep peace throughout the world, to develop friendly relations amongst nations, to help nations work together to improve the lives of poor people, to conquer hunger, disease and illiteracy, to encourage respect for each other's rights and freedoms, to be a center for harmonizing actions of nations to achieve these goals. To add two things here, as we are taking our learning forward, dear learners, the United Nations systems, which is unofficially also called as the UN family. This is made up of United Nations itself and many programs, funds and specialized agencies. Dear learners, we need to make a distinction here. The United Nations programs and funds are financed through voluntary rather than access contributions. Whereas on the other hand, The specialized agencies are independent international organizations funded by both voluntary and access contributions. The United Nations, as we can see in this from the previous discussion, that it works on broad range of fundamental issues like peacekeeping, peace building, conflict prevention, humanitarian assistance, and on new issues like sustainable development, environment, gender equality, disaster relief, amongst others. Now, having said so, when we try to look at the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, once again 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which brought the concept of human rights into the realm of international law. Since then, dear learners, it is very important to highlight that how United Nations has diligently protected human rights through legal instruments and also through on-ground activities. Now, once again, as we try to look at the working of United Nations, we take this very important quote by the then United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon that was dated on 1st October 2015, marking the very significant occasion of United Nations at 70. Quoting from the remarks of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on his remarks at the General Assembly debate on the maintenance of international peace and security, that is, in many respects, the world is shifting beneath our feet. Yet, the Charter remains a firm foundation for shared progress. Close quotes. Having said so, the United Nations funds and programs are established by a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, and they have a focused mandate. The United Nations funds and programs, dear learners, we must take into account that they are funded either mainly or entirely through voluntary contributions and have a governing body that reviews their activities. The coordination is facilitated through the ECOSOC and the Chief Executives Board. The United Nations member states are also elected to the governing bodies. The United Nations General Secretary, the Secretary General, usually appoints the heads of the funds, programs and other entities. Dear learners, for this lecture, in order to elaborate on working of United Nations in several aspects which have a bearing on peace and security, which have a bearing on friendly relations between and amongst nations, because present day world context, when we try to look at it in a comparative perspective from post Second World War scenario towards the post Cold War scenario, has indeed changed. Today national interest is multidimensional, today security is multifaceted. In such aspects, the United Nations funds and program, they increase and augment the reach of United Nations towards new aspects of national interest, security ranging from development to environment. This is why in this lecture we shall analyze the working of UNDP, UNEP, UNFPA, UN Habitat, UNICEF and World Food Programme. We shall analyze them one by one. The United Nations Development Programme is headquartered in New York, United States of America. Its main aim is to achieve eradication of poverty and reduction of inequalities and exclusion. As the web resources of undp.org says, and we quote, UNDP helps countries to develop policies, leadership skills, partnering abilities, institutional capabilities, build resilience in order to sustain development results. UNDP and its signature solutions reading once again from undp.org that how today UNDP, looking at its contemporary work, is trying to reach out to people through signature solutions. And what are they? Keeping people out of poverty, governance for peaceful, just and inclusive societies, crisis prevention and increased resilience, environment, nature-based solutions for development, clean, affordable energy, and women empowerment and gender equality. So this was an insight towards UNDP signature solutions, and while we were discussing, this tells us that from poverty to governance to crisis prevention to environment, energy and gender equality, the idea and the ambit of UNDP work is indeed huge. And this also explains that today, when we look at the contemporary world governance scenario, world governance, global governance, development also have many dimensions attached to them. Looking at some of UNDP's recent work in the similar vein, UNDP has facilitated a global dialogue to define institutions and their capacities. UNDP has used its leading role on core government functions to foster partnerships that will support institutions to contribute to just and peaceful societies. UNDP chairs the United Nations Interagency Working Group on Public Administration and fosters United Nations system-wide collaboration with departments of political affairs, peacekeeping operations and the World Bank. Continuing forward, UNDP is also a co-sponsor of UNAIDS, which leads global efforts to end AIDS by 2030 as a part of Sustainable Development Goals. Next, we shall analyze the working of United Nations Environment Programme. UNEP is headquartered at Nairobi, Kenya. The United Nations Environment Programme was established, dear learners, in 1972. To talk about aims and objectives of UNEP, we read from UN.org, that is quoting UNEP's mission, which is to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing, enabling nations and peoples to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. The United Nations Environment Assembly of UNEP, quoting from UNEA, convened on 23rd to 27th May 2016. Now, the agenda of it also gives us a glimpse about the multifaceted work of UNEP in present day governance. Reading from UNEA, convened on 23rd to 27th May 2016, the agenda to highlight that how today the mission of UNEP is also multifaceted. Quoting from that, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development represents a paradigm shift to replace today's growth-based economic model with a new model that aims to achieve sustainable and equitable economies and societies worldwide, and also ensure greater public participation in decision making, in line with Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. The environment plays a pivotal role in lifting people out of poverty, in ending hunger, in growing our economies, in building peaceful, just and inclusive societies, and in promoting health of people and the planet. Quoting from the same agenda, that delivering on 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the United Nations Environment Assembly commits to contribute to effective implementation of the environmental dimension of the 2030 Agenda for sustainable development in an integrated manner and through setting the global environment agenda, providing overarching policy guidance, defining policy responses to address emerging environmental challenges, undertaking policy review, dialogue and exchange of experiences, fostering partnership for achieving environmental goals and resource mobilization. This is from sustainabledevelopment.un.org, a glimpse of how today the mandate of UNEP is so important, its mission is so integral for the holistic definition of peace, security, development in the global parlance. Next, dear learners, we talk about UN Habitat. UN Habitat works with partners to build inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable cities and communities. UN Habitat attempts to promote urbanization as a positive transformative force for people and communities. Its headquarters are at Nairobi, Kenya. It attempts to promote socially and environmentally sustainable human settlements, development and the achievement of adequate shelter for all. The UN Habitat promotes transformative change in cities and human settlements through knowledge, policy advice, technical assistance. UN Habitat's new strategic plan, if you take 2020 to 2030, 2023, it adopts a more strategic, integrated approach to solving the challenges and opportunities of 21st century cities and other human settlements. Once again, quoting from unhabitat.org on UN Habitat new strategic plan 2020 to 2023, it attempts to reduce spatial inequality and poverty in communities, enhance shared prosperity for cities and regions, strengthen climate action and improve urban environment. Next, dear learners, we talk about UNICEF. UNICEF is headquartered in New York City, United States of America. UNICEF is mandated by the United Nations General Assembly to advocate for the protection of children's right to help meet their basic needs and expand their opportunities to reach their full potential. UNICEF is guided by the Convention on the Rights of Child and strives to establish children's right as enduring ethical principle and international standard of behavior towards children. Now, when we look into the four principles that contribute toward the general attitude towards children and their rights, that how they are based on the notion that they are two equal as human beings, an affirmation of the rights to play underlines that today indeed childhood has a value in itself. The four principles are non-discrimination, best interest of the child, the right to survival and development, and views of the child. And this also tells us that how today, when we look at it, there is an underlying aspect that childhood has an inherent value, and looking at various aspects of children and their rights, looking at children as equal as human beings, UNICEF indeed is propagating the mandate and the mission of United Nations also with respect to international cooperation, peace and security, inclusive growth in a holistic manner. Next, dear learners, we talk about the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme is leading humanitarian organization, saving lives and changing lives. It is attempting to deliver food assistance in emergencies and working with communities to provide nutrition and build resilience. As the international community has committed to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition by 2030, 1 in 9 people worldwide still do not have enough to eat. Once again, this is from authentic UNEP website sources. And in the same line, food and food related assistance, today they are at the most important aspect of any struggle, and one must break the cycle of hunger and poverty. For its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict related areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. Dear learners, we must underline that the World Food Programme was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. Now, we all know that there have been proposals for United Nations reform, and some of the proposals that have a very important bearing with respect to understanding the functioning of United Nations funds and programs are better budgeting, need for better financial oversight, and more efficient use of resources. As we take our learning forward, a very important reference to the book, that is the Essential United Nations. This book gives us an insight as to how from maintenance of peace and security to sustainable development, climate change, United Nations indeed is addressing universal issues, and these issues cannot be resolved by any one particular nation acting alone. Seen in this context, indeed, working of United Nations funds and programs indeed becomes important. Another important work that we must take into account, the Oxford Handbook on United Nations, 2018, Oxford University Press. And this work presents an analysis, that is implications for United Nations in a world full of rapid challenges. So in this place, when we are looking at the changing multilateral landscape, the work of United Nations funds and program indeed becomes important. To take reference to another important book by Richard Jolly, that is United Nations Children's Fund Global Governance That Works, from Routledge 2014. UNICEF, dear learners, is one of the oldest United Nations development funds. It receives support from all countries around the world. Despite problems, international action for children, in this realm, UNICEF has worked remarkably, and this is an example that how today it has made a difference in the lives of millions of children. So this tells us that how United Nations funds and program indeed have a unique mandate with respect to the governance and the development agenda in the global realms. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture on United Nations funds and program gave you significant inputs and insights. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much for being with us for the lecture.